Welcome back to Itali-Echo. This is your host, Viviana Dragani. This is WNTN 1550 AM Global Echoes. Today, my guest is Robert Boog, author of the book Shakespeare's Madness. Hi, Robert. How are you?
Great. How are you, Viviana?
Very good, thank you. So, let's talk about your book. What is it about?
Okay, the book is called Shakey's Madness, How a Mental Disorder Might Reveal the Real William Shakespeare. So I try to use a bipolar disorder as a means of figuring out who really wrote the works of William Shakespeare.
Right, right. So, yeah, the subtitle is very, very intriguing. So, why do you believe that Shakespeare did not write his plays and poems?
Well, there are a few reasons. Many book writers will use pseudonyms. For example, Agatha Christie, Mark Twain, Michael Crichton, Dr. Seuss. Um, and writers usually write. They like to write letters to their friends, and their friends will write them back, especially back in the 1600s. Shakespeare worked in London. His wife and children lived 100 miles away. So that's the perfect place for letters. Yet over 400 years have passed, not one single letter has ever been found written by Shakespeare. And nor any letter, only one letter was ever written to him. So that's kind of suspicious. And also, um, you speak Italian. I know that. Now, just imagine that books were read by the real author in Italian, Spanish, French, and Greek. In other words, these books had to have been read by the real author. And that's modern researchers go back through the plays and they decide this is where he got this plot from, this is where he got this one. So if someone could not speak Italian or read Italian, or myself, I can't speak Greek, so how would I ever be able to read these books? It doesn't make sense. So the real author was able to speak these languages, but William Shakespeare of Stratford, there's no indication anywhere that he ever learned them. So there's just a lot of little questions like this that have bothered academics for hundreds of years, or at least 100 years, let's say. And so when you put it together, it's kind of a mystery. And what my book tries to do is get you in on the mystery.
Okay, so in your opinion, who was the real author and how do you know for sure?
The real author was a man by the name of Edward de Vere, and he was the 17th Earl of Oxford, who in 1575 actually took a boat trip to Italy. He lived there for a year and a half, or over a year and a half. And we find some of the evidence in the plays of Shakespeare. For example, in Romeo and Juliet, he talks about a grove of sycamores that lies north of the city. And that grove of sycamores is still there today. It's kind of wild. And in The Merchant of Venice, Shylock talks about, he has a saying, or a sentence where he says, "I will meet you on the Rialto." Now, the Rialto is not a street, so somebody couldn't look it up on a map. There were no or few books about Italy back in those times, and so somebody would have had to known that it was a bridge or like a place of meeting. There, people would meet on the Rialto. So, but there are what my book does is goes to explore a little bit more in depth about it. And how it got started was on Christmas Day of 2019. My wife and I were watching a video or a documentary actually on Netflix, and it took the viewers on this boat ride through Italy, and it stopped at all the major cities. And interestingly, like so many of the plays take place in Italy. So back then there was the plague, so nobody wanted to go to Italy at that time, and also you had to get special permission to leave England because they didn't want to bring the plague into England. And so you had to come back, go out, get like a special visa. Edward de Vere got that. William Shakespeare never did. So we know that he went there. So, okay, so we're watching this video. I loved it. And then about a month later at my son's, we took him out for his birthday dinner. We were having sushi, and over this sushi dinner, I went on and on about this amazing documentary. And my wife is from Guatemala, and she has a temper that is like a microwave. And on the way home, she basically said, I really didn't care for that movie at all, and she was all fired up. So I had to do some research to figure out, like, how can I prove to my wife, who's my harshest critic, that this person really did or really was the author. And a woman, a Hispanic woman, or a hot-blooded, hot-tempered person is not that easy to convince. But once you add up all the evidence and show where I'm coming from, even a hardened skeptic like yourself might agree that there is some more to this than what meets the eye. Now, one of the things too, for example, because everybody thinks the name William Shakespeare is found on the plays, and so here's, I don't know if you can see this, but it shows, this is a book of poetry by Victoria Lucas. And there's a poem called The Mirror that can be found in it. And it was published in 1962. And what's interesting is in 1970, we can see that the bell jar was produced or published at that time. The author's name, Victoria Lucas, was just a pseudonym for a woman named Sylvia Plath, who committed suicide in 1963. Now, I don't know if you know this, but Sylvia Plath won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1982. So people sometimes say, well, Edward de Vere could not be the real Shakespeare because some of the plays were produced or published after his death in 1604. How can this be? And so I simply say, well, if you look at Sylvia Plath, she even had a book that was published, believe it or not, in 1996. And here's a woman who passed away in 1962. It doesn't make sense, right? But publishing things posthumously happens all the time. Writers use pseudonyms all the time. Now, another thing that I get to when I use the bipolar disorder is that sometimes people will say, well, this is all well and good, but it's all pure speculation. How can you say that someone who died 400 years ago, you're going to tell me that you can diagnose this person with bipolar disorder? Here's the crazy thing about it. It's not like you could take a cotton swab and put it up someone's nostril and check for the antibodies of bipolar disorder. Or you can't take an X-ray. You can't take an MRI. What happens is a person just goes to see a doctor, and usually that doctor does a medical exam, but even that is not a requirement. All that happens is there's what's called self-reporting, where you write down your feelings. Your friends and family members will also write down your actions. And then a psychiatrist will usually compare these things to a chart that's found in a psychiatric book. And that's how bipolar disorder is diagnosed today. So it's kind of crazy that our method of diagnosis is the same as it would be back in 1595 or 1600. But remember, it's a mental disorder. It's a mood disorder that changes someone from being, despondent and in despair to happy. And how I figured it out was during the pandemic in March of 2020. California was, you know, it was shut down like Blockbuster Video. The state was shut down, and on TV, all I could keep hearing was a woman talking about Latuda. And I kept wondering, what is Latuda and how much does it cost? Because every time I turn the channel, here's this woman hawking Latuda. And I discovered that it costs $1,500 for a 30-day supply of these pills. So,
Wow.
and it treats bipolar disorder. And bipolar disorder has certain symptoms. When someone is in a manic state, they have symptoms, and when they're in a more depressed or despairing state, there are symptoms. And a little later that same day, I heard a sonnet on Twitter being read by Sir Patrick Stewart. And in it, he went on and on about despair and feeling depressed. And I joked to myself, wow, it sounds like Shakespeare needed some Latuda. And then I realized, well, perhaps that's true. Perhaps he really did need Latuda because he was, bipolar. And the more I looked into it and the more I investigated, I discovered that bipolar disorder is what I would call a silent epidemic. It seems to be growing. And one of the things that is interesting too is that Sylvia Plath, the poet that we just talked about, who committed suicide, she was also diagnosed after her death as having bipolar disorder. So it's very prevalent among creative people. And to date, and the reason actually that I wrote the book is to help bring out awareness of bipolar disorder, because the symptoms arise when a person reaches the age of 18 through 25. And these are the years that people are actually learning about Shakespeare. And what better time to talk about bipolar disorder than when someone is learning about it? And the person in my mind that it should be number one suspect or the number one advocate for talking about bipolar disorder would be the man who we all assume to be this great writer. So I would call it Shakespeare, because the real author, Edward de Vere, spelled his last name V-E-R-E, kind of like ever. So Shakespeare is who I think that we should start studying for teachers and instructors, and even instructors, especially with the Zoom conferencing and the teaching. Even some of them, I kind of wonder if maybe they are also prone to bipolar disorder too. Because along with, we have these college kids and high school kids who will be up all night playing video games. And one of the symptoms is insomnia, not wanting to sleep, not having all this energy, and then crashing and feeling I can't get out of bed and I just don't want to do anything, being lethargic and stuff. So.
Thank you. Very interesting. How can our audience get in touch with you if they have questions? Do you have a social media presence?
I do. The best way probably, I am on Twitter. That's at Boog1, or my website is www.robertboog.com. And you can find the book Shakey's Madness on Amazon.com.
Perfect.
And read it and review it. Give me your thoughts or whatever your feelings are about it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Robert Boog, for being with us today, and best of luck.
Okay. Ciao.
Thank you. Ciao.